there was a cobalt mine that was being developed in Idaho that was basically mothballed last year because of low cobalt prices. At the same time, China basically doubled down on its investments in cobalt projects in Africa to expand production there because they were able to see the strategic power of having increased cobalt production for the world's electronics market. And they were supported by Beijing, so they weren't necessarily beholden to market dynamics. And so these are some of the situations that mining companies, especially startup mining companies, face in the United States.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about the real cost of electricity, and you're going to discover the real cost of electrifying the world by converting gas-powered equipments to electric. My guest today is Ernest Scheyder. Ernest is a senior correspondent for Reuters, covering the green energy transition and critical minerals. He's also the author of an upcoming book called The War Below, which is lithium, copper, and the global battle to power our lives. Great to have you on the show today, Ernest.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Yeah, so I've read your articles, and also you got your new book coming out, which I'm hoping to get a copy of that as well and read it. I mean, it's got some very interesting stuff, as far as what I've seen so far in the lead up. But I wanted you to kind of talk a little bit about, why you wrote the book and, why you think it's, well, I know it's a great time for it, but if you can just tell our listeners, why did you decide to write it?
Sure. So the book is called The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And I really wanted to bring to the audience this idea of choice, the choices that we really face if we want a green energy transition and if we want all of these gadgets and gizmos that are increasingly being used in our everyday lives powered by lithium ion batteries. And I used to cover the oil and gas industry, Mike. I covered it for about 5 or 6 years. I actually lived in North Dakota for about 2 years covering the Bakken there. And I would get all these questions all the time. Is fracking good or bad? And it really opened up an opportunity for me to talk to folks about sort of the complicated supply chains in the oil and gas side. About 6 years ago, at my day job at Reuters, I decided to switch and focus on critical minerals, things like lithium and the copper and the nickel and the cobalt industries. And I started to see some of the same questions crop up as the EV penetration numbers started to rise in the United States and across the world. And I really started to see folks demand, really, hey, we've got to do something about climate change, but not really think through the tough choices that we need to make in order to achieve this next wave of economic development that will be powered by critical minerals. And so, I purposely in the book focus on proposed mines in the United States. There are some international, but I really wanted US citizens and Americans broadly to really think through these complex supply chains that are really anchoring this energy transition and think through, are there places that are too special to mine? And if so, where are we willing to procure these building blocks? So that really formed the narrative. And it's really a story about people at the end of the day. I didn't want to make it a geology textbook or a book about investing. I wanted to make it a story about the people that live with these choices and are on the front lines of this new economic war that's developed.
Yeah. And obviously, the administration, current administration, well, it started, a number of years back, but,
Mm.
they've tried to been pushing this transition on the American people with, and I agree with you. I mean, really, when you dig into to the, get down into the weeds, I mean, obviously, there's quite a bit that goes into it. It's just not plugging an electric car in your garage and all of a sudden driving down the road with it, right?
Exactly. Exactly. There's so many moving parts here. And sort of a quick story that I like to tell is, I think folks in general understand how crude oil is processed in a refinery into things like diesel or jet fuel or kerosene or gasoline. That process, while maybe not the mechanics specifically are well known, there's just a general understanding that that's how it's processed. But when we think of critical minerals, we have to think of many different ways to not only produce it or mine it out of the ground, but each one can be a little bit different. Lithium, for instance, can be either mined out of a hard rock mine, what you don't really think of as a hole in the ground, so to speak, or it can be produced by separating it out of brine, which is basically salt water. And there's deposits in Chile and elsewhere in the world that have huge supplies of lithium. But then once you actually separate it, then you need to process it further into a type that's known as either lithium hydroxide or lithium carbonate. And that can, depending on the end customer, depending on what their needs are, they have a specific type of lithium that they might want. And they might have different qualities of either type of lithium that they might demand. So think about the type of lithium in a wristwatch battery might be vastly different than the quality you might see in a electric vehicle battery. And so you can just start to see the complexity of the supply chain there right now, and also just the sheer geographic footprint. So take this example. If you produce lithium in northern Chile in the Atacama Desert, then you have to ship it to the coast or truck it to the coast, then ship it across the Pacific Ocean to a processing plant, typically in Asia, mostly in China. And then you've got to process it into a form that can be used in a cathode, which is part of a battery. And then you got to put it into a battery in a battery pack. And then maybe you ship it back across the Pacific Ocean to an EV plant in, say, Nevada, where it's put into an EV and then shipped to, say, Florida. That's an extremely long supply chain, and obviously it increases emissions, which is sort of ironic for a device that is designed to reduce the global emissions. So if we have more production domestically or even regionally in North America, could that abrogate some of that? I mean, these are some of the choices that I think folks should be thinking through and that I really bring to the reader in The War Below.
Yeah, because when you mine these minerals, obviously you have to use diesel in order to do it, or some form of hydrocarbons. And then if
Yes.
you're going to ship it across the world to another country, then you have to use obviously diesel or some form of hydrocarbons to ship it over there. So in the end, is it really green by such a long supply chain?
Well, I mean, it depends certainly on how it's shipped and where it's extracted, but just sort of that long circuitous route twice across the Pacific Ocean, you can see the emissions that would be just from the shipping of those materials is not ideal, certainly. And so that's why with the book, I wanted to highlight on purpose projects in the United States and regionally in the North American continent to help folks understand better, like if these critical minerals were produced more closer to home, we would not only boost energy security, but then we would also reduce the emissions from transportation. You know, Mike, it was only 4 years ago that it's hard to believe, it seems like a long time ago, but the coronavirus pandemic started. And we here in the United States discovered that there were no masks made anywhere in the US. This
Right.
lowly but very crucial piece of medical equipment was not made in the United States at all. And I think that underscored for a lot of people the importance of what supply chain logistics actually are and why it's important to look at where the basic things that you use every single day are made. And so that's just one device that, of course, we all used a lot of masks during the pandemic, but then you sort of extrapolate that onto the energy transition. And you realize that many of these devices that we use every single day, and many of the devices we hope to help us fight climate change, are not really made in the United States, and the building blocks are not made in the United States either. So, where are they produced, and are we willing to accept them from other countries that might not share high ESG standards? You know, I mean, some of the cobalt production supply chain, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, world's largest cobalt producer, sometimes young children, as young as 6 or 7, can be part of that production process. It's in what's known as artisanal mining. And I don't think anyone would say that having a 6 or 7 year old as part of the cobalt mining infrastructure supply chain is a good thing. These children can sometimes be injured or even killed.
Right.
And so I'm not necessarily saying it's that black and white that if there was more cobalt mining in the United States, that situation in the DRC would disappear. But if we're thinking through ways to boost our supply chain domestically, we have to be thinking through, okay, what are the positive effects by doing it here, and can it be done safely? And what are the standards by which we're going to accept it, especially if we want this new energy transition?
So one of the ways I obviously get news about this is, through the media,
Yeah.
and like a lot of other people that are listeners as well. But and from what I've heard through the media is that we don't have these, deposits here in the United States, or we don't have, as much as other countries. And that's why, countries like China, they've gone in and tried to corner the market in Africa, and, and they produce a lot of the rare earth minerals. And like you were just saying, a lot of it is done with very cheap labor or child labor. And so do we have the reserves here in the United States to basically, manufacture our own lithium and cobalt here?
So what I chronicle in the book in The War Below is multiple projects that have gotten consistent no's and across the United States. And when you add them all up, they could produce millions of electric vehicles if the metals were actually processed and produced here in the United States. One that I chronicle in the book is in northern Minnesota that a company known as Twin Metals would like to produce. This is an underground deposit that contains cobalt and copper and nickel, and it would be a huge domestic supplier of this. The tension point there surrounds, though, the type of rock that those metals are in. Once it's extracted, if it's exposed to water, it could form acid.
I
And
see.
what's in northern Minnesota? It's right next to the Great Lakes, the
Yeah.
sort of beating heart of the North American waterway infrastructure. So, you can just imagine acid, the Great Lakes, not really a good combination. Now, I should say that the company that wants to develop the mine has said over and over again it feels that it can produce these metals safely and not have that accident happen. But essentially, the book chronicles the back and forth between the Obama and Trump and Biden administrations as to the fate of the project and the tension point around whether is it worth it to produce these metals here in the United States. And so that's sort of one key example. And I don't come down one way or the other in the book. I really want the reader for her or himself to think through these complexities. But that would be a key source of these metals. So if we're not going to develop it here, where are we willing to have it? Or are we willing to forego all of the technologies that would be powered by these metals? So we're not really thinking through these really sticky situations right now. And you don't just show up to a Tesla dealership and buy a Tesla. They don't grow on trees. They have to come from somewhere. And the same with cell phones and millions of other electronic devices.
Well, it seems like that's what our government's done. They wanted just to manufacture all these electric cars and, basically overlook the fact that somewhere they've got to be charged if you're going to go on a trip. And, I've always said, I think they kind of did the whole thing backwards. I mean, they should have put the infrastructure in first, but,
Mm.
instead of going out and building a bunch of electric cars that people don't want to buy now, just simply because they're afraid that they can't get the range out of them. Now, I'm sure battery
Yeah.
technology is going to change as you move forward in the future. And, the genie's been let out of the bottle. So, obviously there's going to be electric car manufacturing, continues to increase. And I agree with you is that if we're going to mine this, I mean, if we're going to have electric vehicles as a choice, that if people want to buy them, then, that the material should be mined here in the United States instead of, creating, shipping it all over the world to be mined.
Yeah.
Now, I've had the pleasure of talking with, the people that have been in the wind industry
Mm.
and quite several farmers that obviously, and I think in the deal there is that people don't mind having wind. You just don't want it in your backyard, as far as that.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
is this the same with, the country wanting to mine minerals here? We don't mind having electric cars, but we don't want to mine any minerals here in the United States and tear up our land, right?
Well, I did encounter that situation again and again as I was reporting and writing The War Below. A great example that I like to share is the northern Minnesota example that I just discussed. Huge waterway there, and the concern about the potential harm on the watershed. And so a lot of folks in northern Minnesota said, we shouldn't be mining here. You should be mining in Arizona, where there isn't large waterways and where any potential spill would not cause damage to the Great Lakes. But what does mining require? It requires a lot of water. So folks in Arizona would say, why would you want to mine here? You should mine it in a place like Minnesota that has a lot of water. And so both sides sort of said, go in their backyard, not my backyard.
Yeah.
And I was at pains really in the book to not come down one side or the other because I really wanted to bring to the reader this tension point from all sides. And there are multifaceted angles here to this situation. But when each successive project is told a no, then that sort of causes you to scratch your head and say, okay, well, where are we going to get these important building blocks, not just to build electric vehicles and other electronics, but to your point, all the wiring for a charging infrastructure, that requires a lot of copper, just an insane amount of copper. And so we're going to have to get it from somewhere. And right now, China is the world's largest consumer of copper. It's helped power its economy. And the United States does produce a chunk of copper right now, but in order to go fully electric or even approach any of the electrification goals that the Biden administration and others in Washington have, we're going to have to be producing gargantuan amounts more of just copper, and never mind the other critical minerals out there. And they've got to come from somewhere.
So in one of your articles, I read that I guess GM had as far as a hold on, a hold on a lot of the rare earth minerals, and then of course they sold those, was it to a Japanese company, I guess, is who ended up buying them. And, we've done several things like that here in the United States. I
Yeah.
think the Clintons, brokered some deal on uranium that was sold to the Russia Uranium One. And I mean, why do companies do this? They just feel that, I mean, why would they sell it to a Japanese company?
Yeah, so the example you're referencing is General Motors helped create a type of rare earth magnet. And rare earth magnets, not to get too wonky, but they basically help turn power into motion. They're made with rare earth metals. And when they sold this division, basically the primary use was to power seat motors. This was in the 80s and 90s. And so, electric vehicles really were just sort of very niche things then if they were ever thought about ever being commercialized there. And so it wasn't really seen as core to the company's future. And so ironically, they did sell off this division, and it has since, through several ownership changes, ended up in the hands of some Chinese investors. And the plant here in the United States was shut down. Now, fast forward to 2019, 2020, and we chronicle this in The War Below. General Motors realizes that electrification is a huge part of the future of the company. And so it strikes a deal with a US rare earths company called MP Materials, as well as another company to basically build rare earth magnets here in the United States. So this was an industry that they had sold off, and now they realize, oh crap, like we really need this in order to go fully electric. And so that's caused a bit of a scramble there. And so that history we explore in the book, and sort of the tension point around why did GM do this initially, and how is it going to be successful in trying to basically jump back into this space. And rare earth magnets are not just in electric cars. I mean, they're in everyday consumer electronics. The thing that makes your phone vibrate is a rare earth magnet. And there are no known substitutes out there. So China controls about 80–90% of the global rare earths market right now. There's only one US rare earths mine, but it's closely linked to China because China is its only customer right now. So these are another area of complexity that I hope folks think through. And I chronicle in detail the history of the mine as well as the people that are working right now to try to resuscitate that mine and sort of wean the dependence off of China. But it's a huge issue for, say, the Pentagon as well, because most fighter jets, most laser guided missiles, most night vision goggles, and scores of other pieces of military equipment are made with rare earths. So you can imagine why China focused its economy really in this space. And I argue in the book that part of the reason why China's economy is the second largest in the world is because it was focused on these rare earths when the rest of the world turned the other way.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, obviously we've seen that, time and time again. And so do you think that we could catch up here in the US?
Well, there's a lot of different efforts by the Pentagon and others to really try to, I'm not going to say break China's stranglehold, but grow the industry here domestically. Just on rare earths, it can be tricky to refine and process these critical minerals. And so the
Mhm.
company that I was referring to in California, they're in the process right now of trying to resume processing in California. And they've had some small successes so far. We'll see where they go in the coming months. But there's been other efforts by companies in Australia and elsewhere to really shake the tree and really try to grow their industries. The problem has been that China is able to use its pricing power to affect the market, and that does have a big effect on proposed mines. There was a cobalt mine that was being developed in Idaho that was basically mothballed last year because of low cobalt prices. At the same time, China basically doubled down on its investments in cobalt projects in Africa to expand production there because they were able to see the strategic power of having increased cobalt production for the world's electronics market. And they were supported by Beijing, so they weren't necessarily beholden to market dynamics. And so these are some of the situations that mining companies, especially startup mining companies, face in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And we talk about this in the book, but there is an economic tension there as well. Because if the market is just flooded every few years and that destroys your balance sheet, obviously that destroys your ability to create a project. And so that has been a huge bone of contention by some of the mining industry right now.
So I know, obviously you try to look at both sides, when you're writing your book, and I appreciate that. But when people come out like Biden and the administration and they say, well, we need to do away with gas stoves. We need to do away with your gas water heater. We need to all go to heat pumps, which I'm a living example. I've got a heat pump, and that's the worst thing I've ever seen here in Texas, especially when it's 32 degrees. And
I'm
so,
in
but
Houston. I know what you mean.
so anyway, but they just seem to throw stuff and see if it sticks on the wall. I mean, as far as what people want and what they don't want. And I know you had written an article about leaf blowers and, and
Yes.
trying to electrify, going, what's the difference between an electric leaf blower versus a gas leaf blower?
Right. Well, I included that chapter in the book, and we did have it as an excerpt in Fast Company. It's great to partner with them. The reason that I included that in the book is because the more I wrote and reported out the various chapters, I started to get a lot of questions about electric vehicles, which makes sense. But I realized that this topic and theme is about so much more than transportation, and I wanted to broaden it out to show the reader that this is not just about what's in your garage. It's about the many other gadgets and gizmos that are in your house that are powered by lithium ion batteries. So a few years ago, I got a house and had got a backyard, and so decided to get an electric lawnmower and an electric weed whacker and yes, an electric leaf blower. And that took me down this bit of a rabbit hole, if you will, Mike, that I was trying to figure out where the copper and lithium and cobalt and nickel inside that battery came from. And I have a lot of resources at my disposal at Reuters and a lot of avenues that I can tap, but I couldn't figure out where these metals were come from. And I couldn't figure out if they came out of the DRC, the cobalt, or if the copper came from Peru, where copper mining has been extremely controversial. I couldn't figure out if the lithium went across the Pacific Ocean twice, in the example I presented earlier. And so this is just one lowly leaf blower, right? I mean, just magnify that across the millions of other electronic devices that we use every single day across our everyday lives. And so then I think you start to see the importance of really diving into the tough choices that we face here. It's not just about electric vehicles. It's about how we get the building blocks for so many devices that we use every single day.
Yeah, and so what are the real choices we must make today
Exactly.
if we're going to this electrify everything and
Yes.
end
Yep.
fossil fuels? I mean,
Exactly.
it's just I mean, obviously, and then we're not even talking about the permitting process to mine these minerals. I mean, I know in the oil and gas business, when you obviously want to build a new refinery, I'm not so sure there's been a new one built, maybe one in the last 47 years, just because of the permitting process here in the United States. I mean, those things can take 10 or 11 years just to get approved to mine, right?
Yes, yeah, and even longer in some cases. I mean, several of the mines that I chronicle in The War Below have been on the drawing board for more than a decade, and there's no end in sight for when they could actually get approval. Time and time again, from not only mining industry executives, but also conservationists and environmentalists. I mean, I heard a lot of confusion about where to go or how to obtain a mining permit here in the United States. It's very confusing, and depending where you want to operate, there can be a different set of rules that are more linked to geology or geography, and so it can be very uncertain. I mean, think about this, Mike. Let's just say you own 1,000 acres in Nevada, and you're convinced there's a lot of lithium there. What's the first thing you do in order to try to get a permit? Like,
What is,
who would you talk to? Who
yeah.
would you call? It's very, very, very confusing. And so a lot of these companies end up feeling their way through the metaphorical dark. And even those that want to oppose these mines tend to be confused as well about what are the standards in place. And the law that's governed mining in the Western United States has been around since 1872. That was a long time ago. And so there's a request from many quarters in order to update that law and bring it into the 21st century. The law does have some benefits for the mining industry. Right now, you don't pay royalties if you extract metals on federal lands in the US West. And so many companies have used that to their advantage. And it can actually be a far more lucrative to mine EV metals than it can to actually produce an EV. The margins are much, much higher. But there's still that antiquated law out there that governs this. And so this is another tension point out there. Are we going to demand more from our elected officials to bring these laws into the 21st century? And I heard that time and time again from folks saying The permit process needs to be clear. We need to understand the path to a yes or a no. What are the rules in place? And are there standards that can survive depending on who's in the White House? Or every 4 years, does it just change depending on who lives at Pennsylvania Avenue? I heard this over and over again, and I tell these stories in The War Below.
Yeah, and I know in the oil and gas business, I mean, you get ready to do a project, say in West Texas, and all of a sudden you get one of these environmental groups come up with some spotted lizard that they haven't seen in the last 20 and 25 years, and the whole project gets delayed until you
Mm.
do an environmental study to make sure that there's no, lizards in the area that you're drilling in. I mean, it seems like there's a push from a lot of the environmental groups, and they do use a lot of these old laws and antiquated laws in order to delay projects.
Yeah, the main spine of the narrative in The War Below is the story of the Rhyolite Ridge proposed lithium project in Nevada, about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And this is a massive deposit of lithium as well as boron. And if developed, it would supply Ford and other automakers for their electrification plans. The tension that I explore in the book is that this rare flower found nowhere else on the planet lives just above that lithium deposit. And so the choice becomes during the exploration of this narrative, what's going to happen to the flower and what's going to happen to the lithium deposit. And so the story of The War Below looks at that as sort of the main narrative arc by which we explore this idea of choice. I'll leave it to the reader to explore at the end of the book what happens. But the situation really, for me, encapsulated the really necessity for Americans and for really citizens of the world to be thinking through these complicated areas, especially as we're increasingly going electric. I mean, we didn't really think through these tough choices about 100, 150 years ago when the petroleum-based economy took off. And I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that we need to be thinking through these things now as our economy slowly shifts to incorporate more of a materials-based focus.
Yeah, and how do you recycle these batteries and stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, because I've whether true or not is what I heard is that there's not a way really to recycle them at this point, as far as what do you do with it? What do you do at the end of life with these types of batteries?
Right, right. So recycling is a core part of one of the chapters that I look at, and I profile the history of two U.S. recycling companies, Redwood Materials in Nevada and Li-Cycle, which is based in New York State and Canada. And it was important for me to really show how these companies plan to grow a recycling ecosystem, as well as tell the story of manufacturers like Apple, which has been very open about its plans to get rid of what it calls basically stop relying on mines altogether. And so the recycling forms a core part, as I said, of the narrative. If we can get to the point where we're able to fully reuse old batteries, which is an idea known as the circular economy, that will abrogate the need for mines completely. Now, there are a billion estimates out there as to when we could actually get to that point, 2050, 2060, 2070. I don't think anyone has any firm idea of when that will actually happen, but there are, excuse me, but there are attempts to get to that point and to say that, could we be taking old cell phones, old EVs, and old other electronics, completely breaking them apart into their component parts and then reusing those metals inside. I think there's going to be some bumps along the way. I mean, when you transport lithium ion batteries, they're obviously charged and they could potentially blow up. And so there's a transportation concern there. And there's some other physical limitations in the way, but the industry is slowly moving in that direction. And I think it'll be a growth area to explore in the coming years.
Yeah, I was at a conference and I was talking with a gentleman that owned a wrecking yard, and
Mm,
he was telling me that when they get an electric car in, it's wrecked. I mean, the battery's only worth $800 at that point. Is
mm.
what they can sell it for. And I don't even know who he was selling it to. I think he was saying that some people buy them to put them for their solar panels in their homes, but there's
Stationary, yeah.
not much value for them. Once they're totaled or the car's totaled. So I mean, do those things just pile up, or like you were saying? I mean, I guess it's these companies that can recycle them going forward.
Well, I mean, we're still at, I would say, the first few innings of the EV story. And when the EVs become more popular, I think we'll start to really have critical mass there, and we'll really start to see a bigger focus on recycling. Think of an internal combustion engine vehicle right now, Mike. I mean, the lead acid battery has been really the workhorse of that engine for going the past 100 years, really. And when that battery inside an ICE, an internal combustion engine, is at its end of life, there's a well-oiled machine, forgive the pun, where you basically turn it in and it goes into this giant ecosystem where it's recycled, broken down, and the acid inside is basically reused. I mean, when you buy a lead acid battery, there's a small fee associated with that to help power this recycling industry. And so one of the things that I explore in the book is like, could we get to the point where turning in an old EV battery just enters this giant ecosystem where the parts are broken down and the metals are taken out and reused. Now, there's a bit more complexity there because all lead acid batteries are the same, but not all EV batteries are the same. They can have different chemistries in there depending on the needs of the manufacturer. And so I think those irons will have to be wrinkled out, or excuse me, those wrinkles will have to be ironed out. And so we'll see how that goes. But I think getting to some kind of mechanism where consumers are just used to turning in their batteries at end of life will help further grow this recycling infrastructure.
Well, this has certainly been a great conversation, and I'll be very interested to read your book and, find out more about it in the future. So can you tell our listeners how to get a copy of it?
Sure thing. So The War Below is out now. You can buy it at your local bookseller, on online retailers, or anywhere that you buy books. It's called The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And it's a book that's written for everyone because it's a topic that affects everyone.
Thank you, Ernest. I really appreciate you coming on and hope to have you back in the future.
Great to be with you, Mike, and look forward to future opportunities.
You've been listening to The Energy Show with REI Energy. Energize your investments and maximize your tax deductions. To learn more, go to reienergy.com.